Across the country, about 40% of all grade 1 learners will leave the schooling system before finishing grade 12.
The Zero Dropout campaign is a national campaign with the goal of halving the rate of dropout by 2030.
The latest data suggesting that learners from approximately 10% of households not returned to school.
The vast majority of children still only going to school every second day or every second week, which means that they're missing out on a huge amount of teaching time. When we have disruptions to education like this, what happens to children?
Some estimates suggest that around 300,000 young people left the schooling system each year. Now, the COVID-19 school closures, together with the economic shocks of lockdown, have amplified the disruptions that typically lead to dropout.
A lot of learners were already struggling with their literacy skills. And what's going to happen is that they're more likely to fail because they have not been engaged for enough time in terms of the curriculum. And so once they start failing and they're repeating grades, they start to get demotivated, and eventually they disengage from the schooling system, and then they're more likely to drop out.
A dropout is often thought of as someone who is lazy or irresponsible and has no interest in school anyway. That is not what we have found.
Dropout has been something that has been normalized to such an extent that it's easy to cover it up with a pass rate and not to look at how many learners have actually started school and completed school.
Perhaps now, more than ever before, dropout is top of mind, and it's being counted. It's being registered as a serious concern, and there are concerted efforts to re-engage learners.
How do you get teachers to become more interested and more observant to what's happening? And also, once somebody's dropped out, how do you get them back in again?
Many of our partners have found that going to find a learner, finding out what is the issue, what is the problem, and working with learners to re-engage them back into the school system is a process that can occur, but it takes a longer period of time. So investing our energy in when the learner is in front of us, are we doing everything we can to connect with them, to ensure that we are responding to their individual needs?
What is it that we need to do together to have a coordinated national response to preventing dropout in our country?
A very good day to everyone, and welcome to this very important moment, of course, where we launch the Zero Dropout Action Summit. The summit is all about supporting schools to halve the rate of dropout by 2030. My name is Africa Melane, and I'll be your host for this morning. This Action Summit and the toolkits are brought to you by the Zero Dropout campaign, which is an advocacy group with 2 dedicated programs of action and a national network of not-for-profit organizations who are implementing partners working in the various schools. But first, we'd love to learn more about you. Let us know where you're joining us from. So please type your name of your organization or school, and don't forget the town where you're joining us from in the chat box on the platform. We'd love for you to engage as fully as possible over the next 90 minutes or so. Why are we here today? Our hope is that the summit is a launch pad for change. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll be sharing a recommended plan of best practice and dropout prevention toolkits for all schools. While this might sound overwhelming for some of you working in challenging environments, don't you worry. We've broken it down to simple, immediate, medium-term, and long-term action steps, which we'll be sharing with you in your Action Summit pack. If you haven't already downloaded one of our toolkits, you can do so now by downloading it from the chat box or by going to the Action Summit page, which is on zerodropout.co.za. It's as simple as that, either clicking the link on the chat box now, and it will take you to the tool, or go to zerodropout.co.za and you'll get the tools there. I'm sure that you're aware that before the pandemic, school dropout was a hidden crisis, barely featuring on the national agenda. The topic would arise as a peripheral issue in the public discourse during the announcement of the annual matric pass rate, but dropout is a fringe topic no more. In July of this year, researchers revealed that an additional 500,000 learners left school during the pandemic, taking dropout to a 20-year high. Children in quintile 1 to 3 schools are estimated to have lost almost a year of learning, dealing a significant setback, sadly, to early grade reading. So severe is the impact, in fact, that researchers estimate that it could take up to a decade to undo. We know that if you hear these issues of concern are close to your heart, the time has come to tackle dropout with a plan based on best practices and models that work. We don't want more talk, we just want action. And by the end of this Action Summit, we want you to leave here with a clear, short, medium, and long-term actions to prevent learner dropout in your school. If at all you are inspired by what you hear here this morning and afternoon or learned today, please feel free to share on social media using the hashtag Zero Dropout Action Summit, as well as hashtag Change Starts Now. And you can tag us, of course, on any social media platform using the handle @0xdropout. Feel free to screen grab shots of the summit on your phone or PC, share them with these hashtags on social media. And of course, if you hear one of the incredible and inspiring speakers we've got planned for you today saying something memorable, you're also welcome to quote them in that post. Now, it's time to hear from someone who is committed to making the large number of learners who disappear from the school system each year visible by advocating for a proactive response to reducing the rate of school dropout. In her role of Program Director of the Zero Dropout campaign, Merle Mansfield is responsible for bringing the campaign's vision to life. It's lovely to have you here, Merle. Good morning.
Good morning, Africa, and good morning to everyone joining us this morning. I am incredibly excited that we are finally having this conversation. And I think that for me, dropout really was a personal issue, and I think it should be for everyone else. When I was attending high school on the Cape Flats in the Western Cape, I started with a group of 300 grade 8 learners in my grade 8 year. And by the time I got to matric 4 years later, we were only 56 matriculants. Now, at that time, when I was a learner in the school, that didn't really bother me. I didn't necessarily think of it as an issue. And I think because it had been such a normalized trend within our school and many high schools, and only later in life did I start questioning why that happened. You know, what could be going on within our system, within our schools, that it seems to be commonplace for us to have so few matriculants, even though we have such large numbers of learners who access the education system annually. And so that's why I'm excited today, because I really want to inspire everybody to start asking why, to start feeling uncomfortable about the learners who are disappearing from the system.
And we're certainly hoping to be inspired alongside, without a doubt. There are systems, I suppose, specific challenges when it comes to the issues you've highlighted, but one has to also reflect on the broader societal issues which can contribute to dropout.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in no way is dropout a simple issue. I think it's extremely complex. I think international research states that there are as many as 40 different factors that could influence dropout. I think importantly, it's for us to understand that there is a period or a process of disengagement that happens before a learner eventually drops out of school. And so there are factors that happen, you know, that push and pull learners from school that we can intervene against before it turns into eventual dropout. And so I think at a societal level, that's the really important thing to understand. And then at a school level, I think that, you know, even though this seems like an intractable problem, we've now uncovered from our research and the work on the ground that interventions don't have to be complex. And that, in fact, school communities can work together to come up with interventions that are contextually suitable for, you know, where they are. And that what we're trying to do with this toolkit today is really to surface some of those lessons and inspire others to start trying within their spaces where they are, and to try and take some actions to prevent disengagement from reaching the heightened stage where learners are dropping out of school.
Well, Mel, thank you very much indeed for that. We'll be getting into more detail about some of the ways that school communities can work together to come up with simple interventions in this Action Summit. I'm looking at the chat function right now, and I can see many schools and organizations who are represented here today. It's great to see so many educators, academics, organizations, and just genuinely people who care about education ready to take on an active role in reducing the amount of dropout that we report on a regular basis. Now, we'd like to introduce you to a few educators as well as students who shared what it feels like to be part of a school and a community with high rates of dropout. All right, I think it's back to me. There is a video where we'll be reflecting on personal stories of resilience and what it means to be part of a community that is challenged like this. Yes, Lisa.
I am studying civil engineering technology at the University of Johannesburg.
My name is Mokgotsi Solomon Matakala, and I've launched the campaign called #Dropouts Must Fall.
We have so many problems in our country. The best key is education.
It's a crisis, and I think it affects communities very negatively, because we believe that education, we have so many problems we can use it to transform the society.
Once they've dropped out, they are exposed to so many things out of the school world.
Need awareness campaigns to ensure that people are aware of the issue.
In most cases, it's emotional problems where they just need a shoulder to cry on, you know.
Our struggles often, they have the tendency to leave us caged. But when the champion teacher comes into our life, they make sure that they give us the key to open the cage.
I believe in working on the ground with the children and with the parents so that we come up with strategies on how we can reduce the dropout rate, because their ideas are most important and they can play a vital role in ensuring that we reduce the dropout rate.
I started struggling to read for meaning when I was doing grade 4, and the teacher then, she gave me new books, said to me that every day after school I must come to her. Then she began to teach me studying everything from scratch. She made me fall in love with the idea of going to school every day.
So the things that made my job very hard, it was just absenteeism and large numbers. Since absenteeism is a big problem, I introduced a bring a medical certificates kind of thing. And ever since that, the absenteeism rate has dropped.
Dropout is a national crisis. So we believe that we should involve the parents so that they act first, organizations after, and then we involve the Department of Education. The aim is to educate all the learners of our country.
I believe that that teacher would come in their lives and make them see that they are powerful beyond measure and there's more that they can do only if they allow that teacher to be in their lives.
I think for me, there were two massive takeaways from that video, which I imagine resonated with you as well. Firstly, this is all our responsibility. I think collectively we have a role to play, whether we are educators ourselves or not, in making sure that we reduce, preferably to zero, the number of our kids who are dropping out in the system. And secondly, it's about getting that champion teacher sometimes. It could be a parent, could be a caregiver who's going to help you unlock that cage so that you can enjoy the freedom, I suppose, that comes with a good quality education. How many of you felt like many of the educators that you saw in that video? If you aren't an educator, how many of you have heard stories like this before and wondered what you can do? If any of it resonates with you, just type yes in the chat if you feel that way, so that we can just see how many of us are resonating with that. It seems to many of us are obviously going to be impacted with this. And now that we've framed the experience in many school communities, we want to share some interventions that the Zero Dropout campaign, through its implementing partners, have been doing to reduce the dropout that you could explore for your school in this next video.
Early warning system is a tool that can be used to prevent dropout. It takes a lot less resources to prevent a child dropping out than actually to reintegrate them back into school. This tool was created to look at some of the early warning risk factors for when children were dropping out of school. So it's basically a robot system that we're working with. So with red being the most high-risk children. So the higher the score, the more possible it is that this child is in the red category.
This community is a hotspot for gangsterism, so it's dangerous outside. Because of the unemployment rate in this community, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, yes, a lack of motivation of learners and also parents. Poverty is a main problem here in the community. Our teachers we can't give everything all the time, but Kula can also add that extra education and values for our learners at school.
So there's a better life for the child at the end, and there's hope for the child. If we don't work close, then I can see many dropouts.
En so het ons begin weet met die kindertjies en die kinders het in my hart en begin te kruip en sy het ek het begin te dieper kyk. Ek kyk nie net voor nie, maar ek kyk die storie agter die storie. Die kind kan miskien nie lees nie. Die kind kan nie skryf nie. Dan is daai die probleem eintlik. Of hy kan kry nie liefde nie. Verstaan, liefde is baie belangrik vir 'n kind.
An early warning system tool has really helped us within Kula to inform our decisions as to what kind of services the learners that we work with need.
Liefde is baie belangrik, is it nie? As one of the teachers are saying, we often forget the role and function that we play as educators goes beyond just delivering the curriculum, but often providing the care and nurturing that perhaps could be absent in that child's life otherwise. Some great ideas in that video. But Merle, I wonder if we could take a step back and start perhaps by talking about what it takes to prevent dropout, considering that this is a complex problem.
Sure, Africa. I always feel so inspired when I see videos like this where that was in fact a parent who is a volunteer that was talking about, how they're supporting the school. And I think firstly it starts with us shifting our perception that dropout is normal. And I think really to see children as not lazy, naughty, uninterested or disinterested in school, because they are not, and to understand that we're needing to respond to what they need. And I know that this can feel overwhelming, and I think the useful thing about a tool like an early warning system just allows us to look at learners at a very individual level and to understand what are the key things that we need to respond to. And then second to that, to respond to those needs. Now, I know currently many, schools and teachers I talk to would say it's really difficult to respond because there are so many needs and there aren't enough resources. And I think what's really exciting for me about this toolkit is that we're talking about how to crowd in support services, how to institutionalize support services. We've seen with the organizations we've been working with and the schools that have been so innovative in finding ways to really build in support in a classroom, to capacitate teachers, to bring in volunteers and surrounding services within communities and build the bridges between schools and communities and make them stronger. That's really helped to keep learners, help learners keep their grip on schooling. I think one of the things we can also really talk about is one of our implementing partners who, were doing at-home learning during the pandemic. So learners weren't able to access school, and many of them didn't have devices or data to be able to connect via virtual connection. And so there was some at-home learning programming going where learners were learning on street corners, for example, but having some services facilitated to them through, a volunteer or an intern that's being supported by an organization. We also saw some of that happening in using feature phones in very rural areas in KZN, where learners stayed connected to some group or form of learning through peer support groups, homework support, and even psychosocial check-in just in the morning to check, are you up? Are you out of bed? Have you managed to read something today? Have you finished, the assigned tasks for the day? Do you need help with something? And really creating space for learners within the crisis to still have a moment for themselves. And so I think it starts with our shift into how we're perceiving young people, really understanding what the level of the need is, the learner's level of need, and then finding ways to support them and institutionalizing that support.
Many participating in this Action Summit will think, well, that needs resources, that needs time, that needs a whole long list of things. And what we're presenting today with the tools and the toolkit is that you can contextualize it obviously to your needs in a schooling environment, but most importantly, to whatever resources are available to you.
Absolutely. And I think we've shown now over the past 4 years with these organizations that's been working in different school spaces, which are very differently resourced and some of them very strained in resources, how working innovatively has helped. For example, when we're talking about, going to look for learners who are absent, finding community members who are volunteering to do that and helping teachers to go knock on doors and ascertaining reasons for why children haven't come back to school. If we're thinking about schools in one community sharing resources, one school might have a sports field, one school might not. And they are neighboring schools, really strengthening even relationship between schools within a particular community to share resources amongst each other, to create enrichment opportunities for all the learners within that community. I think that there's been some really innovative things that we've seen come through. And the toolkit really talks about how we maximize that kind of strengthening support and building these safety nets around children in a very intentional way.
A little later, of course, we'll go into the details around the action steps, right? We've got immediate, medium, and long-term actions that you can take and implement almost tomorrow that will go a long way towards ensuring that we achieve the goals of the Zero Dropout campaign. Merle, thank you very much. Merle Mansfield is the program director, of course, for the campaign. Now it's time to introduce our panel of experts who will be joining the conversation on how to create enabling environments for dropout prevention. We start with Mayke Huijbregts, who is the Chief Child Protection for Unicef in South Africa. Her work in advocating for vulnerable learners in Southern Africa highlights the relationship between learner well-being as well as education outcomes. She demonstrates how disruptions in households and communities can affect a learner's grip on schooling, and she has worked with Unicef for more than 18 years and holds the position of Chief of Child Protection for the organization in South Africa. Mayke, it's lovely to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure.
It truly is a complex minefield that we're working with here, and yet there are solutions that we can explore, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There are many important solutions which we need to address at all levels as a collective responsibility, and I'm looking forward to giving you a bit more details in the next question. Thank you.
In fact, let's jump straight into those details, Mayke.
Okay, so, what is very important is that we look at what the South Africa School Act provides for, as it does provide for a compulsory attendance by children until grade 9. And that is normally the age of 15. And the Act says that if the child who is supposed to be in school is not at school, it's a criminal offense to cause for children not to be at the school. So daily attendance is administered by the schools on the EMIS system. And if children are not at school, the school will communicate that with the caregiver if a doctor's report hasn't been submitted. So whilst legislation on compulsory education and implementation monitoring of that remains a challenge, and that is a big gap. So we're all needing to support DBE with the information management system that they hold in the education that tracks the attendance and performance and other admin data of children in the education system. And the majority of countries have similar education attendance and information management systems. Unicef supported DSD as well with the development of a real-time monitoring tracking tool. This allowed child and youth care workers in the field to monitor the well-being of children real-time and make a care and referral plan the moment that children are not well, and follow up with the caregiver to address the underlying causes that might prevent dropout or psychosocial issues, etc. And then the role of the workforce, child and youth care workers to keep an eye, like the peer support groups just mentioned, are extremely important to live in the life space of the most vulnerable children and understand what are the issues that need to be addressed for children to not drop out of school. So EMIS, real-time monitoring, tracking, and the workforce. Thank you.
Apologies, Africa, you're on mute. Apologies, Africa, you are on mute.
I think we've just lost audio for Africa. And while we try to get the audio back, I think Africa, can you hear us?
Apologies. My apologies. It has been my job to make sure that all the microphones are switched on. I was saying that if you have any questions for any of our panel members, of course, you can use the chat function to share those questions. It's lovely to note that when asked the question that dropout is a complex problem that requires a whole of society approach, 100% of those people participating absolutely agreed with that sentiment. Rebecca saying lack of participation from parents is also one of the biggest contributing factors in school disengagement. George Chikono saying it's good to be here. I've been looking forward to this meeting. George, it's lovely to have you here, and all of the other participants who are joining us today. To introduce you now to the next panelist, Lynn Van Der Elst is bringing with her more than 40 years of education development experience to the Department of Basic Education's portfolio on learner care and support. Her role in assisting the department's mainstreaming of care and support across the education system is integral to shaping a national response to dropout. She's also the co-founder and former CEO of MIET Africa, which is an NGO committed to improving the lives of children and young people across SADC, the region, through quality education. She also is the portfolio lead for care and support for teaching and learning investment, which is with the National Education Collaboration Trust. Lynn, I can't wait to hear what your contribution to this important conversation is going to be. Good morning.
Morning, Africa, and morning to everybody. I must say I'm really honored and truly thrilled to be part of this summit. It's just, I mean, it always has been important, but it's absolutely critically important that we come together, and summits like this give us, and when I say us, I'm talking about the practitioners in the schools, the parents, the caregivers, civil society organizations, governments, funding partners, UN agencies, all coming together to address this really, really critical problem.
It truly is. Lynn, what are some of the low-hanging fruit, shall we call it, that we can put in place, in your opinion, tomorrow in order to address this issue? This working tool is going to be one of those low-hanging fruits, I imagine.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm so excited to be part of this. In fact, you know, I've been engaging with Merle because we're involved in working across the SADC region in the area of care and support for teaching and learning. And there is a SADC policy framework on care and support for teaching and learning that all 16 member states have committed to implementing. And South Africa, as one of the member states, is mandated to mainstream care and support across the education system. And that means from policy all the way down to schools. And I think for me, the focus needs to be on schools. And that's why I really am excited about the Zero Dropout campaign, and in particular, the tools that they've developed, because they are practical tools that teachers, parents, school management teams, school governing bodies, and learners themselves can actually engage with and use to make a difference tomorrow.
No, for sure. Let me pose Chantal's question to you. Chantal Kyobojo on the chat function saying unemployment due to COVID restrictions is also a contributing factor. I'd indicated to Merle that many of the educators, the parents, those who care about our children's education will tell us that, well, we don't have the resources to make this possible. That can't be the answer, surely.
No, you know, I'm going to share with you an example of that it's not about funding and it's not about resources. And unfortunately, the example I'm going to share you is not a South African one. It's actually in one of our neighboring countries, Malawi, where actually there's greater poverty than in South Africa as a whole. But I spent a week in a community, a rural, impoverished community in Malawi not so long ago. And what I saw there was zero dropout from the school that served that community. And when after a week of living in that community, I reflected on why it was working, school was working, was that everyone was aligned, was in tune, had a common vision for the children of that community. And that included the children themselves. So you had leadership, you had different stakeholders playing their role, knowing their role, being affirmed, being respected for their roles. And for me, that coming together, and I think that's what we heard Merle and we've heard coming out in the videos, that there's no one person, agency, organization, or
Lynn, unfortunately, being kicked out by the system, but we'll hear a little bit more about the example in Malawi that she was sharing at the minute that she is able to rejoin again. Our third and final panelist is Nompumelelo Mohohlwane, who joins the panel. Her recent work has brought the learners' attendance concerns into sharp focus with hard facts and figures that show the impact of the pandemic on education in South Africa. The evidence-based approach from NIDS CRAM reveals the damage caused by disruptions to schooling, particularly to early grade reading. She's also part of the unit responsible for system monitoring and research on the effectiveness of education interventions within the Department of Basic Education. Bumi, I'm sure you are unbelievably excited that we are launching this tool today.
Afternoon, everyone. Well, I have a minute, still morning, everyone. I am, very happy to be part of this panel. I'm especially thrilled that we're having a comprehensive discussion that disaggregates the responsibility at different system levels. So what is the national department responsible for? The legislative framework that was cited earlier, what can communities do? And I'm also excited that we're thinking comprehensively because different children in different age categories are affected by different things.
And that's what you work with as a researcher within the Department of Basic Education, right? Literally detailed stats and data that will enable you and your colleagues to hopefully design interventions localized to realize the best result.
Indeed. So I think what we especially value in general is good data. And like you mentioned, different levels of disaggregation are important to allow us to respond effectively. So I'd say we need good data to track and monitor the system in general, from administrative data, like how old are the children that are enrolling in schools, how often are they in schools, are they attending? And then you also need to be collecting outcome data though. So how well are these children performing in terms of what they're learning? Currently in the South African system, we still only have an externally administered exam at the end of schooling. And I think the current conversation about doing similar things in previous grades is going to really help us. So we're not waiting until the end of schooling to know really across the country in a comparative way how well children are performing.
Because as we said at the beginning of this live stream, we often talk about dropout at the end of their 12th year of schooling, right? Where often politicians will calculate the number of learners that went into grade 1 12 years before and say this is the true matric pass rate, and it's often a very, very low number, which is worrying and concerning given the amount of investment we continue to pour into education on a yearly basis.
Absolutely. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. I'd say prior to the pandemic, we do still see the highest level of dropout happening at the end of compulsory schooling. So this is at 15 or in grade 9, and that adds a different complexity, right? So in terms of what was said earlier, the legal mandate to force children and parents to come to school is over at that stage. But if we unpack that and think about it, even for those children, what I would say we often see leading to dropout, even if it's delayed until 15 or the end of compulsory schooling, is weak foundations. So from a schooling sector perspective, I think others, Merle and others in the videos have spoken about some of the pull factors that are happening in societies. But I think we are increasingly realizing that it's often because children haven't mastered the basic skills. They are now getting to grade 10, gearing up for matric, and they are now being assessed in ways that they are unable to cope. So even if they would desire to stay in the schooling system, they're effectively not learning well enough to continue.
No, for sure. Mayke, let me bring you back into the conversation here. You've had experience working with early warning systems for child protection and child well-being. Could you share some examples of how this has worked in South Africa, and I suppose compare that to how it's worked globally?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Africa. So what UNICEF does, we are working in 198 countries around the world in close partnership with governments, as well as with civil society, academic institutions, and with, caregivers themselves. But in South Africa, we have been working with DBE to strengthen the education information management system, which really administers the data and administration of children as per the regular attendance, but also their performance rates. So what we are doing is provide technical assistance and also look for regional examples how to better analyze these data in order to understand what are the trends that lead to either low performance or to dropout, and to work with DBE to support them in the tracking of these attendance rates. Also, we have introduced a real-time monitoring tracking tool, especially after COVID and the recent social unrest, that really looks at well-being of children at all times in their households by child and youth care workers, following up on the well-being of these children and making a care and referral plan. This is being used in South Africa and also around the continent, which came originally from the overseas crisis, to really understand how orphans and vulnerable children are faring and follow up on their well-being all the time. So it is important that in support, in addition to the peer support groups, to look at the role of a child and youth care worker also as a monitoring system with some warm bodies on the ground who are in the life space of the most vulnerable children in order to early identify signals of distress and work with the caregivers to really create a nurturing care environment. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. Lynn, you've worked to develop some protocols for schools to improve school culture and help schools reach greater preparedness. What do these look like, and how are schools implementing them?
So thanks, Africa, and my apologies for having been dropped off earlier. I did mention the SADC policy framework on care and support for teaching and learning that provides guidelines for ministries of education to integrate care and support across the system. In the case of South Africa, the DBE has done really well at mainstreaming across policies, budgets, structures, but of course, the challenge with everything is in the implementation. And whilst we see examples of really excellent caring and supporting schools across the country, we want to see that in every school. That's our vision in South Africa. And so I wonder if we could show the slide that has the Cstl handbook. Okay, maybe just stay on this slide for a second. This is the 2 pillars that care and support for teaching and learning are based on, and they're really important. One is the system strengthening, and that is what I was talking about, government, policies, budgets, strategy. So for example, the DBE has a branch dedicated to care and support, headed by Dr. Granville Whittle. Within that branch are many directorates responsible for nutrition, psychosocial support, infrastructure, water and sanitation, etc., etc. And then down at district and school level, we have structures such as the district-based support team, which schools and teachers and school principals will know about. And then in schools, we have mandated support structures called school-based support teams. And that's the one pillar. The other pillar is critical, and that's why I'm excited about this summit, because it's about bringing partners together. The DBE nor schools can do this on their own. Care and support cuts across many sectors, government and civil society, our UN agencies, our funding partners, all need to come together and coordinate and towards a common prioritized vision for South Africa. And school dropout is one of those priorities. If I could just quickly show the second slide, which is, that's it. So South Africa has developed its own national model for Cstl, which is based on the priority and needs of South Africa. But what they've also developed, the DBE, is a Cstl handbook. And I've just wanted to show the kind of information that's provided in that handbook for each of the priority areas. So for example, under psychosocial support pillar, you would have a description of psychosocial support, what the legal and policy mandate is for it. You'd have the national minimum requirements for a school in terms of providing psychosocial support. You'd have the responsibilities of the school community as a whole. You have who are the key external support partners, and then what is expected in terms of monitoring and reporting. But as I was saying, you know, it's all very well to have these things, but if schools and teachers are not supported to use these tools, then we don't achieve what we want to achieve. And I think the summit goes a long way towards highlighting what is available, that low-hanging fruit, and then how do we all rally around schools, those of us that are working with schools, supporting schools, to actually use these tools?
Thank you very much for that, Lynn. Mayke, you touched on this or alluded to it a little bit earlier, but could you frame a bit more UNICEF's approach to learner-level data monitoring to prevent dropout?
So to come on top of what Lynn has just said, UNICEF is working closely with the Department of Education in strengthening the data information and collection systems. And that is mainly EMIS as well as the school administration management system, a subsystem of EMIS. So it is important that we provide not only the support to make sure that these systems are working, but especially that the data are analyzed in order to know what needs to be done to prevent early signals of distress from becoming worse and ultimately leading to school dropout. So we are working closely, Africa, with the department on the implementation of the Cstl framework, and we are very excited about this conference and in continuing our support to DBE at all levels to make sure that there is a complete nurturing care framework at all levels implemented, led by DBE, but with a solid information management system that is used, updated and maintained and analyzed in order for us to know how to use data to create improved actions.
We've often heard about the ABCs of dropout: the academic performance, the behavioral issues, the chronic absenteeism. Why, in your opinion, are these important? That's still for you, Mayke.
So these are extremely important because all of those indicators, they pertain to issues that are, for example, behavioral issues. This is where your socioeconomic issues come to the fore. What we have seen is, as a result of COVID and pandemic, we have had widening poverty. We have issues of school closure leading to children not having school meals, with having higher unemployment levels and a lack of caregivers being able to sustain their livelihood. We are seeing high level of safety problems in the schools, but also in the homes, and children experiencing violence, abuse, but also crime, teenage pregnancy, substance abuse, etc. So your behavior issue is extremely important for us to understand what are the underlying causes we need to address in order to prevent dropout, and work with the caregivers, with the parents directly and in the schools. And for chronic absenteeism, as was mentioned before in one of the films, is an extremely important indicator, because if the child is not at school for long, it's very unlikely that the child will return. So all these three core indicators are extremely important, especially also for academic performance. If a child doesn't perform well, he or she will not be very likely to think that the school is the right system for her to proceed in life and feel not confident to continue with their learning. So all these three indicators are extremely important. Thank you.
No doubt. Thank you very much, Mayke. Lynn, you will agree with a lot of that, won't you?
Of course, for sure. I definitely agree with all of the points Mayke made, but I'd like to maybe just come in with something that I believe is really important, and it's linked to what Nompumelelo said about what the data has shown in terms of dropout actually being largely because of lack of foundations, learning foundations. And for me, I think, coming from being a teacher in a classroom, if learning is not interesting and it's not relevant to the learner and it's not fun or exciting, we see learners dropping out, not physically, but dropping out because they're bored, they don't see the point. We hear young people saying, what's the point? Why are we learning this? So I also think that we need to look at how is our curriculum and how it is being delivered, does it suit the children of the 21st century? And we know our young people, even the youngest children, have access to exciting things going on around them through social media, through access to other media. And I think if we don't make the learning in the classroom exciting and interesting and relevant, we lose our learners. And I think that is a real risk of dropout.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed, we couldn't agree more with that, Lynn. Merle, let me bring you back into the conversation here. We've heard a lot of examples and best practice suggestions. What about what we're not tracking in South Africa and what the schools can do now about it?
Thanks, Africa. I think I'm just really excited to hear everybody's contributions. And for me, really, it's speaking to moving away from a really compliance focus, so are you in school every day, to a relationship focus, to understanding why are you in school every day. And so really what we're trying to do with the early warning system and with the toolkit that we've provided is to start really focusing on disengagement as a continuum of child participation. So at what level is a learner engaged, at what level is a learner participating, and how does that correspond to their risk for dropout? Similarly, how does that correspond to their risk for, repeating a grade, for example? So really using, these indicators and the risk matrix to help us to identify very quickly so that we can prevent and we can respond. So I'm really loving, where we're going with the conversation. It's talking about using the tools now to understand how we move away from compliance, or how do we integrate relationship with being compliant.
Nompumelelo, you've been tracking available attendance and dropout data during the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been lots of disruptions in the academic year. So how have those played out in data both nationally and provincially?
Sure. So maybe let me start by saying we were tracking using, and the study that's been cited often in some of the comments by the panelists has been the NIDS-CRAM study. It's actually a household level survey where an adult is asked questions, a bunch of questions on their household, and it includes aspects like, has your child been attending school, as well as how do you feel about schools being opened, and are you worried about the return to school? It is a nationally representative survey, and what we found there was we estimated that about 500 learners were not attending school. This is obviously based on using our interview data and then weighting it to the population, which is what you're able to do with a nationally representative sample. We saw that this was especially worse in Free State and Eastern Cape. But I think more interestingly is we saw when schools were phased in terms of the return, so about August 2020, specific grades were open, older grades, so matric grade 7, while younger grades were phased in, so they were returning on a more staggered basis. What we saw at that stage was a wealth disparity, so inequality by wealth. And effectively, what was possible was that as a school, you could apply to your provincial department and ask to reopen your school in extra grades, more than the officially open grades. And we saw that often, as expected, considering our education system, wealthier schools have more space in their classrooms and have bigger schools and are therefore able to open more grades. We are thankful, though, that from about August, when all children were allowed to, once all the phased reopening had been completed, that inequality by wealth had disappeared. But maybe a final section on what we've seen is there has been a recent analysis of administrative data. So this is based on enrollments in actual schools, not at a household level like the NIDS-CRAM survey. And this compared the term 1 2020 and term 1 2020 and term 1 2021 enrollments to measure, are we seeing similar patterns of enrollment across time? And thankfully, this is showing estimates that are much lower than what we saw in NIDS-CRAM. Effectively, we're seeing that about 16,000 first-time students, learners, I guess grade R and 1, have not started school. So parents in that way are withholding and delaying the start of school. And then when we speak about the compulsory ages, so once you're 7 and 15, grade 1 to about grade 9, about 19,000 children have not returned. And so obviously these have different implications, different messaging, and possibly different issues that we're having to address. But I must say we are pleased that the non-attendance, I guess, that we saw did not convert to dropout for the majority of children.
Which is really good to reflect on. I mean, 16 and 19,000 are still staggeringly high numbers, but as you say, nowhere near to the estimates that we're anticipating. What are the possible long-term implications of learning losses, of poor attendance, of dropout in the overall health of the education system?
So I think Lynn had, and others I think had spoken to this as well. Firstly, when you attend poorly, this in and of itself leads to learning losses. So we sometimes think you just lose one day of learning, you can just copy from your friend's book and you're up to speed. What we're seeing, though, actually in continued disruptions is not only are you missing the content of that day, children actually tend to forget. You don't, and I think all of us, we don't all hear new information and absorb it fully, 100% the first time we hear it. Some of what we're saying in this conversation, people will remember 20% of. But if we keep having the same conversation and reinforcing and building on that, it then becomes knowledge. And so that's what absence leads to. So you're absent, that compounds, it becomes learning losses. In the early grades especially, you then do not build the required skills, so you don't learn the underlying skill that you will need in history and geography, etc., because you never learn to read. Similarly, you never get to calculus because you never learn to add. And so those gaps in skills are particularly important, and they compound. And then, as we know, in South Africa, there's a very high wage premium for having completed education. Matriculants earn much more than people without matrics, and people with even further education earn much more than people with just matrics. And so it's not immaterial to not have completed your schooling in South Africa. It has real long-term economic and life consequences in terms of addressing poverty and even the extremely high unemployment rate we're seeing in the country.
That's so true. Mo, what are some of the ways that schools can overcome these problems in accurate learner-level data collection?
So I think that one of the important things are for us to start valuing the data collection to not only inform decision-making at a high level, but also to inform our school responses. I think that for a long time, we've been trying to really institutionalize using data from a district level to have conversations with schools about, what it is that they could do and what trends we are seeing. So I think we're really wanting to see more of that in South Africa. It's super exciting when NITSCRAM was doing this work and people were all tuning in to learn about what's happening across the country, how are households responding. And I think very similarly, if we are starting to look at data in the same way within our schools, where we're starting to identify why are these three indicators important? So yes, we are not just tracking attendance, we're also tracking how learners are behaving within the classroom. What does disengagement look like? What does disruption look like in terms of a behavior? What does chronic absenteeism look like? What does academic achievement look like? And how do these three things interact with each other to give us a risk matrix, for example? Really gives power to teachers, it gives power to schools, and it empowers us to be able to identify issues, to identify trends, to be able to put in place preventative measures. And when we do a lot of prevention work, we are able to, we minimize the kind of extent that we have with intervention work, which is more resource intensive, which is often less effective and takes longer times to achieve outcomes for. And so really shifting the idea that data is just for us to report back, but also for us to understand what we're doing and how we can do it better.
All right. Well, if you're watching this, then you should have already received your toolkits, including the early warning system tool that Merle just mentioned. But if you haven't, please get yours on the chat function right now. We'll also include links to it, of course, in an email that you'll be receiving after the summit, which, by the way, will have the entire recording available for you to distribute to colleagues and community members who you think will benefit from this. So let's dig in a little bit more about the Zero Dropout toolkits and how they can help. Merle, could you start by explaining how they came about?
So over the past 4 years, Africa, we've been piloting some of these resources with 4 organizations, working across the country. Masipumbane Development Organization in East London. I saw some of the members in the chat earlier on. Similarly with National Association for Child and Youth Care Workers, and they predominantly use child and youth care workers within school spaces, and we tested that model for a bit. Also with a Kula Development Group out in Paarl and Community Action Partnership in Swellendam, who very interestingly tried to connect all of the schools in Swellendam community into a network approach to preventing school dropout, which has, shown some really interesting results. And so working with these organizations, piloting these ideas and having schools try these innovative strategies has helped us to surface the learnings of what's important, surface what people can do, and how to do things in a particular way that helps us to get there faster. So really, these are some best practice guidance ideas that provides valuable information Firstly, to all the different role players that participate in dropout prevention. I think that most of the Mayke, as well as Lynn had mentioned earlier on, that there is a need for partnership and collaboration to prevent dropout, and there are many stakeholders that need to participate in doing this. I've read some comments as well talking about parental participation and community participation being essential. And I think because this is something new within the sector, and it's a new kind of intervention that we're trying to develop, finding framing and identifying your role and responsibility as part of the stakeholders within that grouping can be difficult. And so the tool provides some guidance on what that could look like. And give some ideas to school leaders on what a roadmap can be for their school. So there's some really interesting diagrams that guide you through yes and no answers around processes and protocols that your school could have in place. Similarly, for district and circuit officials, helping to offer schools the support that they need, and also identifying for schools what they can directly ask from the district in order to strengthen and institutionalize the support services within schools. And to help stakeholders like NGOs, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, volunteers, and others in the community and around to understand how they can build partnerships with schools, but also for schools to have a guide on how they can crowd the support in. So there's some lovely demonstrations in terms of the case studies, as well as templates and tools that schools can click on to see how they can put those processes in place, how they can maximize their relationships with stakeholders, and how they can build safety nets around learners to institutionalize the support that we're talking about, and implement the EWS so that they can have the system of really identifying disengagement and responding to it effectively.
To explore a bit more on that safety net, Mayke, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation here. Who are the main stakeholders or role players, do you think, who would be pivotal in preventing dropout?
Thank you so much. So the primary responsibility for the child lies with the caregiver, with the biological parent, first of all, and then with the caregiver. So it's very important that we unpack the role and responsibility of every duty bearer around this child. One is the parent and the caregiver, and then it would be the school, the teacher, and any other partners that are working in and around the school, can be the learning support agent, the child and youth care workers, but also civil society, religious leaders, traditional leaders, all that are creating that community structure around a family, and especially vulnerable families. And then, of course, the line departments, from DBE to the Department of Social Development, but also of local government. And then your role of social service professionals, they play a pertinent role. So the moment we understand the role and responsibility of every duty bearer around creating a nurturing care framework for children, and understand the root causes that lead to the dropout, we can start addressing it. For example, poverty, unemployment, etc. We need to look at issues of social protection, job creation, livelihood generation. If it is mental health issues, if it is safety issues, all of the underlying causes that can lead to dropout, we need to unpack, compounded by the role of the different duty bearers, and empower primarily the caregivers to create that nurturing care framework and make sure that the schools operate in safety and monitor the well-being of this child at all times, and that parents and teachers communicate, have monthly meetings, especially when a child identified signals of distress. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. Merle, back to you. How does a school or an organization that wants to help position themselves in the stakeholder matrix?
So there's a lovely flow chart within the toolkit that allows you to find where you are currently, so who you are. And I think what the arrows allow you to do is to answer some tough questions. Am I doing this yet? Or am I not? And I think just as we answer those questions, to also just be self-reflective of whether, when we are doing the practices that the questions are being asked around, whether that information is actually being used to facilitate responses So are we collecting the facilitation to comply with the requirement, or is it really so that we can respond and institutionalize the kind of drive we're trying to create within the school space? And so I think part of what the toolkit allows us to do is to have a view of what others have tried, and really to have a space to see what's worked in other spaces, and to have the opportunity to get some indication of how to start in your space, and really allow schools to then take some of the previous lessons that other schools and other contexts have tried and see what they can apply within their space. And so it's self-driven, and it is really a place where you can go and evaluate how much you've done and how much you still need to do in order to get to a place, where you feel confident that you do have a process in place and your school is actively working towards solving dropout. I think also that the toolkit really works around providing strategies for how to crowd in the support. So who are key stakeholders within your community, how to do a community mapping and understand what the value is of the different stakeholders within the community that's around you, and some guidance on how to start that conversation. I think many of us have been, for such a long time, kind of been stuck in our spaces, struggling alone. That the toolkit provides us an opportunity with some strategies of how to start that conversation with others, how to draw them in, and how to strengthen that support services within our schools by crowding in these people that are around us. So helping us to identify that quite easily or quite quickly. And so really for me, there's this important positive thing that this toolkit can unearth for all of us in showing the potential and the energy that you can bring in your space to doing something. And that's been really crucial in what many of the organizations and schools that have been part of the pilot have done over the past 4 years.
Lynn, how do we then harness that energy? We've identified the role players. We have a sense of what needs to be done. How do we encourage and facilitate collaboration that is going to be essential for us to succeed?
So, Africa, if you don't mind, a message that I would like to give is creating a Cstl school, or a school that provides a caring and supportive teaching and learning environment, is not too difficult. We mustn't overcomplicate things. And I wanted to just share an example, and the reason why I want to share it is to show how a school can actually make a major difference to a vulnerable child with just some very simple inputs, but where there's been, I talk about the 4 C's: consultation around a common purpose, communication amongst all the players, connecting between each other, between players outside the school, within the school, and collaborating. But I would like to just give an example of going back to 2001, the height of the AIDS pandemic. And when I was still with MIET Africa, we worked in the Eastern Cape, and I want to just share an example of a school. At that time, we were working with schools to develop caring and supportive learning environments. And it literally was helping the school establish a school-based support team, capacity building for that school-based support team that included parents, community members, and teachers, training of teachers in identification, assessment, and referral processes, and having a culture of care in that school. And I sat down with a teacher in that school, and she told me about a 9-year-old in her class who had been bright, achieved academically, and had suddenly become low performing, withdrawn. His mother had died from AIDS, and initially she thought he was grieving. And she spent some time with him trying to support him. But as the weeks went on, it got worse and worse. His behavior, he couldn't sit still. He kept walking around. He didn't want to sit down. So she went to her school-based support team, and she asked the community members on that team to investigate. So they went to the child's home, and to cut a long story short, what they found was that the mother had died, and this child was now an orphan, and a foster parent had taken on the child. But this foster parent was using the child support grant for alcohol and was actually abusing this child. So when this little boy cried because he was hungry, she was cutting him with a razor blade on his genitals and would say to him, "Go and cry on your mother's grave." Now, they brought that back. They were able to bring South African police services in. They were able to bring the Department of Social Development in. And that child was removed from that incredibly cruel environment. You know, that fueled my passion for this work, because I thought there was one child, because of a school who had been capacitated, had a support team, had teachers who knew how to identify, had a support network of parents, community members. And that is what Cstl is about. It's, you know, it's not rocket science. It's really about the heart. It's about an ethics of care. It's about connecting, collaborating towards the best interests of the child.
That is truly a heartwarming story, Lynn, and thank you very much for sharing it, because it really just, it helps us put a face, if you like, to the work that we do. I imagine if I asked every participant who's on this live stream now to share a story, they'd probably have similarly heart-rending stories to share. And let's celebrate the fact that we are all committed to making sure that a child who experienced that kind of life will not be dropping out of education, and they will continue to flourish in the future. Let me, in a moment, I'll ask Merle, by the way, to just share with us what the immediate steps that you can take going away from this Action Summit. We only need another few minutes of yours, but let me note that Nompumelelo Mohohlwane is in fact employed by the Department of Basic Education. A number of the participants have been asking where the Department of Basic Education is. She's a researcher at the Department of Basic Education, and of course she works with NIDS-CRAM, which is a survey. They've done 4 books, I think, so far of their research that they've shared generally. So very much situated there. But Merle, many people will go, how are we going to basically take these tools we are leaving them with today and implement them tomorrow? What are the action steps that they need to take?
Thanks, Africa. I think really just to kind of put it into perspective, I think there's 3 ways to look at this. I think there's some immediate things we can do that's really going to help us to respond to what Nompumelelo was talking about earlier, which is many children who have had sporadic attendance or haven't really come back to school, who perhaps are uncertain about whether they should be returning to school. And so immediately it should be reintegration. That should be where we're focusing. And our toolkit does explain how to do reintegration. It also gives some ideas of how we can maximize reintegration with the kind of networking and support networks that we've been speaking about. And so what that looks like is really rapid track and trace. It's really finding out if this learner's not here, where are they? And so to find and help people to help us find where learners are and understand why they haven't come back. And then once they are back, to really help learners get reorientated to attending school. You know, I think that for nearly 2 years, we've had disruptions to school attendance, on and off school attendance, and it's going to take us some time to get learners into the normality of attending school and finding new ways of attending school. I actually just recently heard that there were 2 schools in a community in Cape Town that did grade assemblies this week. You know, just because the weather's been better, so they could do some outside assemblies and get every grade in at a time, with every parent's grade at a time, to explain how the rotational timetable is working, because there's still some confusion about that. So even for the learners who are attending school, there's still some confusion. And then I think the last thing is to help learners feel contained about, you know, the academic losses that we've been talking about. There's a lot of stress and anxiety around it. In the 4th term in this country, it's assessment season in our schools, and learners are preparing for assessments, teachers are preparing for assessments, and there's a lot of anxiety about what we've managed to cover this year in terms of curriculum and what we've managed to do. And similarly, we've seen a lot of psychosocial impacts because of the pandemic. And so I think if we can do those three things and maximize our response to those three things immediately, we might see a better kind of uptake of schooling and return to school next year. So starting the communication around rapid track and trace, where are our kids, getting people reorientated to the classroom and getting them back into the classroom, and really putting in place some containment measures, both for academics, but as well as psychosocial support. And then in the medium term, I think the toolkits allow us an opportunity to take a breath and to see what's happened and how we need to do it, and to put in place some plans for next year. How are we going to start doing the things that the toolkit is suggesting, and how could we perhaps adopt some of the strategies that are being suggested in there for our school lives in the medium term. So really just ensuring that we are managing our tracking and our data tracking properly, that we have started thinking about our network of support and how we're building that around our schools. Lynn just mentioned the school-based support teams. I think that we've had great examples of school-based support teams functioning really well. And we've put those lessons into the toolkit, how to structure a school-based support team, how to run a school-based support team meeting, how to do referrals effectively. So really to strengthen that kind of formal structures that are mandated within our schools. And then to get our school contact details and administrative data up to date. We saw that at the start of the pandemic in 2020, that there were a number of schools that didn't have contact details that were accurate for learners. And so really to prevent any kind of further disruption to schooling, we want to make sure that all administrative data, contact details for parents, for children, there's been a lot of migration because of the pandemic, making sure that those kind of details are up to date so that we have them at the tip of our fingers. And then in the long term, we're hoping that, with the adoption of the early warning tool system, making sure that we can predict when learner disengagement is getting to spike or getting heightened so that we can respond early on, and that we're doing this tracking very intentionally so that we can keep track of trends in our schools and really look at disengagement on the continuum. One of the participants commented in the chat that we're starting to look at the system as the problem and not the child as the problem. And so I think if we can start doing that shift from today and really tracking what that disengagement is, we have a better chance in the long term to prevent many of the learners from dropping out of the school space permanently.
It's actually very encouraging to read that in the poll that we shared with you a few moments ago, asking whether dropout should be a key measurable or key performance area for those in the sector. 100% of you said yes, and I couldn't agree more. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of my panel members. It has been such a helpful dialogue. There's some important takeaways which I hope you'll be able to take back to your schooling community. And most importantly, as Merle literally a few moments ago spelled out, put in place those actions, both in the immediate term, in the medium term, as well as in the long term. So to Merle Mansfield, who is the Program Director of the Zero Dropout Campaign, thank you very much for your insights. Lynn Van Der Elst, who is the Care and Support for Teaching and Learning Investment Portfolio Lead at the National Education Collaboration Trust. Thank you for your time this afternoon. And to Mayke Huijbregts, who is the Chief Child Protection for Unicef in Southern Africa. And of course, Nompumelelo Mohohlwane, who is a researcher with the Department of Basic Education. You all have just been incredible in your input today. Thank you as a participant for joining us this afternoon. It indicates to us that we have a committed community of people who want to make sure that we realize zero dropout. It is all our responsibility to make sure that our kids, our children, our future generations are empowered with the tools that they will need to ensure a future that is bright and successful, not only for themselves and their communities, but for all of South Africa indeed. We have once again dropped the link for the toolkit that you will take away. I'm hoping you will not only click on it and obviously navigate it as we have unpacked it for you this afternoon, but share it with anyone else in your school community or your broader community who you feel needs to get information about this and to implement it. It is all our collective responsibility. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Have yourself a wonderful Tuesday.